is Bridget Zilke. I'm the marketing manager and I help with the public programs as well. I'd like to welcome you to the White House Historic Site tonight for the 6th of 9 lectures that we're hosting in conjunction with our exhibit, Frank Lloyd Wright, a Wisconsin Original. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to give you some information about our next presentation. It will be held on Saturday, September 16th at 1 p.m. Unlike this presentation and all the others, it's not going to be held in this building. It will be held in the Wright Carriages Pavilion. Out on the table where we have our surveys, I made a copy of a site map and labeled it Map to Venue for George Van Nydecken Frank Lloyd Wright Lecture. If you take one of these maps and follow the black line with the arrows, it will lead you to the Carriage Pavilion. It is really almost in the center of our property, and we have 240 acres. So if you plan on coming on Saturday, September 16th, this will be very helpful. We will also have volunteers and staff directing you back there, but again, this will be beneficial. I also wanted to bring to your attention this postcard, Save the Date postcard. It does list the rest of our programs that we have scheduled, so please take one of these with you, and we've decided, have some more lectures focusing on different aspects of Frank Lloyd Wright's life next spring. So probably in March, April, and May, we take the exhibit down at the end of May. So hopefully by November 4th, we'll have a list of what those presentations are going to be. And finally, I want to recommend that you also pick up one of our calendar of events. This highlights all of the events that we have going on until December of this year. And we, for instance, this weekend have something that's not related to Frank Lloyd Wright. It's our Wright Carriage Driving Days, the 2nd annual. And it's a competition where many drivers of horse-drawn vehicles will be out competing in different types of competitions. And there will be judges watching them, judging them on their turnouts, judging them on their reinsmanship, judging them on the speed of their walks and their trots. And it's really a neat event to come to in that you see people dressed very formally, being seated in very beautiful vehicles and pulled by gorgeous horses. So it's definitely something to come out and see if you're available this weekend. Competitions start at 8:30 on Saturday and 8:30 on Sunday. And our speaker will be one of the competitors, so you'll see her this weekend too. But again, I'm up here on behalf of David Warner, the site director, to introduce our speaker for this evening. Her name is Vicki Boda, and I first became familiar with the name because Howard Kitsky, who's in the audience and one of the planners of this weekend's event, told me about Vicki and some research she had done in the early 2000s, research on vehicles that we have in our collections, 2 vehicles. And one of the vehicles I had been passing on a pretty regular basis as the rental event coordinator. It was parked in our storage space right next to where we have weddings. And someone had told me, that's a vehicle that was owned by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's an omnibus. And Howard told me that Vicki had done the research and written a very nice article. So we contacted Vicki, and she was gracious enough to share the article with us. And she actually is the reason that we have this lecture series taking place focusing on Frank Lloyd Wright, as well as our Frank Lloyd Wright Wisconsin Original exhibit. So thank you, Vicki, for your inspiration. Vicki grew up on a horse farm in northwestern Wisconsin. Her parents' favorite Sunday afternoon winter pursuit was a drive on one of the frozen local lakes. With Vicki tucked between them in a Portland cutter put to a Palomino American saddlebred, they enjoyed winter in a one-horse open sleigh. While attending the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Vicki had the chance to see several Frank Lloyd Wright structures and fell in love with his architecture. She started collecting information, including a small library of books on the subject. In the early 1980s, Vicki leased a pony for her daughter, and because he was trained to drive, she began driving him. Eventually, the Bodas became part of the carriage driving world, joining the Carriage Association of America in 1983. Vicki began driving in carriage shows about the same time. Vicki has worked on numerous Carriage Association of America committees and was the president for 3 terms. She has researched and written numerous articles for the Carriage Association's official publication, the Journal, including the Frank Lloyd Wright Carriages article, which was published in 2003. Her presentation tonight will document the mystery of the carriages that remain at Taliesin and Spring Green, Wisconsin, and how they were used by Frank Lloyd Wright, his family, and the fellowship apprentices. It will include the search for that documentation and the relationship of some of those carriages to Wesley W. Young, to the Wesley W. Young collection housed in our Carriage Museum at the White House. Without further ado, I'll let Vicki step up and start her presentation.
Thank you and good evening. For those who are carriage enthusiasts in the audience tonight, you're going to be hearing a whole lot about Frank Lloyd Wright. And for those of you who are Frank Lloyd Wright enthusiasts, you're probably going to hear way more about carriages than you really wanted to know. Before I begin this presentation, I want to make a little disclaimer. Kind of like they do on the news when something is going to appear and they want to warn you that it might be upsetting to you. Well, for some of you, some of the pictures in here of carriages are going to look pretty decrepit and upsetting. And there's really nothing to do about that. The Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, and I'm a member of the foundation, spends the money that it earns and is donated to it to maintain the architectural treasures of Frank Lloyd Wright. And there's never enough money to go around for all those treasures to be maintained. The carriages are just such a tiny bit part of Frank Lloyd Wright's life that money is not available for their maintenance or use. Keep that in mind if you see pictures of something that you think is sadly neglected. It's only because the money needs to be spent on more important things. I used more than 20 secondary sources and more than 40 primary sources in my research. Many of those primary sources are now deceased. So I'm so glad that I did it when I did it. I had personal interviews, phone interviews, and electronic and traditional letters. I hope you enjoy the story I'm about to tell you and enjoy sharing the mystery that I worked to solve. I dedicate this to Mary Jane Hamilton. She's a Frank Lloyd Wright historian, and I could never have done all of this research without her help. I have been a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture for a very long time. It is rumored in my family that my grandfather, George A. Nelson, and Frank Lloyd Wright were acquaintances. I have no tangible proof of that, though I do remember my aunt telling me about it. They were contemporaries, spent lots of time in Madison, and were both friends of William T. Evjue, editor of the Capital Times. Perhaps the rumor is true. In 2000, Annie Randall, knowing that I was a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture, asked me to follow up on a tip from one of her customers that there were carriages at Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin. So often when carriage enthusiasts hear something like that, what it turns out to be is not a carriage, but a farm wagon or something similar to that. It took a few months to get permission to look at them. They're not on the regular tour. On a beautiful October weekend in 2000, Jim, Annie, and I, with camera and notebook, arrived at Hillside and were met by an apprentice who had been assigned to us to show us the carriages at Midway Barn and at Taliesin. And if you'll notice right where those limestone pillars are on Midway Barn, that's where the carriages were. I also want you to notice something else there. The color of the barn and the roofs, you're going to see it over and over again in this presentation. It's called Cherokee Red, and if you're familiar with Frank Lloyd Wright, it was one of his favorite colors to use. A little bit closer, we're going in under those pillars, and that's where we found them. Now that area is open to the weather, and it's on an earthen floor, and there were lots and lots of tunnels underneath where rodents had been digging. This is what we found. Behind a snowplow blade, a stock tank, an old car, a stove, and a pile of lumber, we found, and I'm using the names that I jotted down in my notebook. You'll notice as we go through this presentation that some of the names change as I learn more about the carriages. Unable to move the snowplow blade, Annie and Jim dragged out as much as possible, fitting bits and pieces back together. So we have a cutter, a wagonette, a phaeton, and a dog cart that was visible when we first walked in. The wagonette, well, this is what I jotted into my notebook. 6 to 8 passenger with wagonette-style seating. That's longitudinal seating along the sides of the vehicle. A coachman seat, a full fifth wheel. Whoops, I knew I would do that sooner or later. This is the fifth wheel right here. 7-leaf side and 6-leaf back springs, steel tires, double back step, leather seats, 36-inch front wheels and 46-inch back wheels, a pole, and paint, but not original. It's Cherokee Red. And we found what I jotted down as a sidebar phaeton, 4 wheels, a sidebar. The sidebar is the, stops the front wheel from turning any farther than the side of the carriage. A double perch, and a perch is a longitudinal piece that goes between the front and rear axle. 2-leaf spring front and rear, 46-inch rear wheels, offset spokes, and paint, not original. You guessed it, it's Cherokee Red. As we crawled around between things that were piled in there so I could get a side view of this carriage, I could see the clouded glass on the lamps. The lamps were rusted onto the vehicle. And as I peered through that clouded glass, I could read Brewster and Company on the lamps and on the hubs, Brewster and Company, New York. Now this is important because the Brewster records are maintained, and we can look into those Brewster records and know who ordered the vehicle, if we have the serial number, when it was ordered, how much they paid for it, and a lot of other things, details about the carriage. So that was a find when we saw that it was Brewster. I couldn't find the serial number, and I didn't have much of anything to use to try to get a part of the carriage off to do it, but Howard Kitsky later on took off the lamp bracket, and on the right-hand side, you can see the serial number right here. It's 23155, and that also agrees with the Brewster records, which are 5-digit identification numbers. Another carriage that was in the corner, I called a dog cart, It has back-to-back seating, a full fifth wheel, tailgate, lamp brackets, leather upholstery backs and drops, a dash height of 66 inches, so it was for about a 16.2 hand horse, white rubber on the tires, and if you look on that left-hand side slide, that's the white rubber off of one wheel that was tossed into the carriage. Lots of carriage rubber was white at one time. The front seat splits, the back seat reverses. It has real louvers, and if you'll look on that left-hand side, those are the louvers. They're in a bamboo pattern, and it was so that hunting dogs could be carried underneath the carriage and the hunting dogs could get air. A splinter bar of 34 inches, back wheel 50 inches, 4 4-leaf elliptic springs, and it's got its original paint, black and burgundy, which was considered the millionaire's colors. And then we found this little vehicle all tucked in between everything and in bits and pieces. I called it a 4-wheel gig because it has a gig body. It has 3 perches, and if you look on that left-hand side, see these longitudinal pieces that go between the axles? Those are called perches. It has embossed basket weave panels, and this is pretty interesting. If you'll look at this close up, that's an embossed pattern that's stamped into the body of the carriage. It only had 2 wheels remaining. They were both the same size. All 4 wheels were the same size, 43.5 inches, with offset spokes. The steps covered in embossed leather. Passenger seat back, which is called a lazy back. And this slides on a bracket across. Handhold at front of seat for ease of getting in, and 4-leaf springs. But this was in really poor shape. You can see it's pretty cracked up. It hadn't been used in a long, long time. And then the last thing we found was a side spring Portland cutter. And lo and behold, it had a carriage maker's tag right there. And it says, Owasso Carriage and Sleigh, Owasso, Michigan. Why is that important? Well, it's just one of the great things when you find carriage maker's tag. It not only tells you who made it and where, but in this case, it helped to date the vehicle. Because in 1886, the Owasso Carriage Works was formed. And then by 1896, it was called the Owasso Carriage Company. And then by 1906, it had changed to the Owasso Carriage and Sleigh Company. So we know that it was made at least in 1906 or later. The company went on until 1921. So that gives us a pretty good chance to date that carriage. There was still a little piece of floral carpet left and a little slice of burgundy mohair upholstery that was original to it. But it doesn't look too bad in this picture, but it was in 3 pieces, so we just set it back together. So, it looks like it's all one thing, but it's in pieces. The apprentice that had been assigned to us quickly lost interest because we were spending an awful lot of time writing down and measuring and jotting things down and oohing and awing when we found something that went together. And he quickly lost interest. And he could tell, I think, that we weren't going to do any harm. So he left us and wandered on back to Hillside. But first, he took us up to the garage at Taliesin, up above on the hill, and cut into the limestone hillside. And you can see the limestone blocks that are mortared there. The garage is into the hillside, and so it was very, very damp. We found 2 more carriages. This one I called a gig. It's a type of 2-wheel cart. It's on rubber. It has gooseneck shafts, which are curved shafts, 78 inches in length, so it was for a small horse. 36-inch singletree, leather upholstery, and Cherokee red paint over every bit of it, including all the metal, which is certainly not a traditional way of restoring a carriage. And I don't think that carpeting is original either. And the other vehicle in the collection in the garage was a governess cart with wicker sides, on rubber, 38-inch wheels, 71.5-inch shafts, so that was for a pony, 48-inch long longitudinal seating along the sides, and possibly an older restoration. It's kind of hard to determine when that restoration was done, but certainly in better condition than most of the other carriages. Okay. Carriages are at Taliesin. We determined that. But just because it's there doesn't mean that Frank Lloyd Wright used it, or that the family used it, or that the fellowship used it. It could be just stored there for some reason or other. I wanted some kind of photographic evidence that would prove to me that Frank Lloyd Wright used these carriages. So before we left Hillside, I got the name and the contact information for the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation Archives in Scottsdale, and the name of Bruce Brooks Pfeiffer, who's the head of the archives. And the next day I placed a call to him and told him what I was looking for: photographic evidence that Frank Lloyd Wright used the carriages that are still at Taliesin. And he said, I don't know if I can find you that, because there's no category in the archives for carriages. They're not important enough. But he said, I'll try. And a few hours later, he called me back and he said, I've found evidence, photographic evidence of carriage use. But he said, I don't know if they're going to be the carriages that you saw or not. He had looked in the family section of the archives, and that's where he found the photographs. So he said, I'll photocopy them and I'll send them to you. You can tell this is a long time ago, because this isn't the way we do it now, for heaven's sakes. We'd either send a picture on our phone or we'd scan it and email it. We certainly wouldn't be making photocopies and sending them by mail. But that's what happened. And when I got the photocopies a few days later and I opened the envelope, the first carriage that I saw, I knew I had evidence right there. That's the wicker governess cart. And on the left is Brandock Peters, Frank Lloyd Wright's adopted daughter, Svetlana's son, and his father was Wes Peters of the Fellowship, driving his pinto pony Diamond to that governess cart. So, okay, I was excited. I've got proof. But I wanted more, of course. And the next picture I looked at, the front, if you'll look on that left-hand side, the front carriage is the gig that I found in the garage, that we found. And Frank Lloyd Wright is indeed driving it with Olga Vanna as his passenger. And the carriage following is the Brewster Phaeton, and it's being driven by Ken Lockhart and his bride, who was Frances Nimpton. Both of them were a part of the fellowship. So when I saw that picture of Frank Lloyd Wright, I knew we were on the right track. This was worth pursuing. That same sidebar Phaeton, this time on the left, driven by Joe Fabrice, a member of the fellowship, and I interviewed him when I was in Scottsdale at the archives and had a lovely talk about the carriages, and he told me about driving them and so on, and he just recently died this year. So one of the great interviews that I had a chance to have before something went wrong. And if you'll notice, for the carriage enthusiasts in here, see that little safety strap they've got there? It looks to me like it's a line off of a bridle holding the girls in. Those little girls, we can date this photograph fairly accurately, because the little girls are Celeste Davison and Leslie Lockhart. Her parents were the ones getting married in the previous picture. And so when they looked at it, they figured it was about 1952. And then this. This was where Mary Jane Hamilton came in to help me. The picture on the left-hand side was taken for the Tower Hill pageant at Spring Green in 1938. Now, I don't think anybody's driving that carriage. This is a posed photograph. That's Frank Lloyd Wright's sister Maginelle in front. And the girls are sitting along the sides. We think it's a centennial photograph. Now, Tower Hill is a part of southwestern Wisconsin's history. It was the Helena Shot Tower that was built in 1832, and it manufactured lead shot for ammunition. And what they did was drop molten lead off the tower into water, and as it fell through the air and hit the water, of course it hardened, but it also turned round. And the Helena Shot Tower was used until 1860, which doesn't make sense to me because that's the start of the Civil War, and wouldn't you think they'd be making ammunition? But they must have been using some other method because the shot tower ended then, and it was purchased in 1889 by the Unitarian minister Jenkin Lloyd Jones, who was from Frank Lloyd Wright's mother's family, and now it's a state park. So that vehicle on the left was being used in that centennial. It's not the exact vehicle that's on the right, and I can show you why. The one on the right is the one in the Frank Lloyd Wright collection, and it's got its dash still intact. And the one on the left just has the frame for the dash. But, as we're going to discover later on, there were more than one of these. And so it's still part of that. It has the brackets for the canopy top, so there were several of these vehicles. And the little cutter, well, this is not a positive identification, but it's certainly a possibility. On the left-hand side is a sleigh ride from the Wisconsin Historical Society archives that the Lloyd Jones family had. That's Frank Lloyd Wright's mother's family. And if you look, not at this first bobsled that's right in front, but right behind there, do you see those little runners back there? It's very similar. If it's not the same, it's very similar to that being used. And the date falls in right because the photograph on the left, they estimate was between 1890 and 1910, and that sleigh maker started changing its name and came in 1906 to 1921, so it falls in correctly. So it's possible that it is. I've got my photographic evidence, but I want more. I want written evidence. I want to know something about these carriages. I want to know something about their use, not just that there were a couple of pictures taken of them. I want to know how they were used. So I decided to keep going with my research. Of course, I had the same trouble doing the research that Bruce Brooks Pfeiffer was going to have when he looked in the archives. If you buy a Frank Lloyd Wright book, and I've got lots of them, and I bought lots more when I was doing this project, there's no category in any of them for carriages. They're not in the table of contents, they're not in the index, they're not in the bibliography, you're not going to find them. So the only way you're going to get the evidence you want in writing is to read the whole book. And luckily, it's a pretty interesting subject. So I read at least 20 books on the on Frank Lloyd Wright and did find quite a lot of written evidence. I'm not going to give it all to you tonight, but to understand where the carriages and their use may have come from, it's necessary to understand Frank Lloyd Wright's background. He was born in 1867, and he spent summers in the valley. That's the nickname for the Wisconsin River Valley near Spring Green. He spent summers there with his mother's family, the Lloyd Joneses, learning about farm life and undoubtedly driving horses. His aunts, Jane and Nell Lloyd Jones, created the Hillside Homeschool starting in 1886. And it was a very unique school, and it's important in this not just because of the part it plays in Frank Lloyd Wright's carriages, but because you're going to find out that it was the basis for the fellowship that Frank Lloyd Wright developed later on. It had a strong philosophy of learning by doing, and the students had sleigh rides and were met at the train by horse and carriage. But it also had a unique perspective at that time. It was both a country day school and a boarding school, and it was co-ed. And all of the students were expected to learn all of the things in the curriculum. So not only the classics, but woodworking, girls got to do it too. Cooking, boys got to do it too. So it was a unique concept for a school at the time. And when they needed a school building, his aunts commissioned him. This was his first commission. Now, that building on the left does not look a whole lot like what we think of as Frank Lloyd Wright architecture. This is a very early one. But the building on the right, which replaced it at Hillside, looks very similar. It's the Prairie School. And it still looks quite similar to that. So the students, and I found it in writing, did homey activities like sleigh rides, and we saw a picture of one of them. And there's that sleigh ride picture again, and this is from a quote by a teacher at the Hillside Homeschool about the sleigh rides. And this, and Mary Jane Hamilton found this for me, is a quote from the Weekly Home News, which is the Spring Green newspaper in 1894, and it tells about the Milwaukee Buggy Company selling a fine wagonette and three-seated canopy top wagons to the home school. Okay, that's where they came from. That canopy top vehicle, that's where it came from. We've got proof, we know the date. And there it is. And it says, those belonging to the home are handsomely lettered and have the monogram of the school upon them. And if you'll look closely right there, it says Hillside Home School. The correct carriages. But unfortunately, the Hillside Home School eventually fell on hard times and was going bankrupt. And the aunts sold the whole works to Frank for $1 in 1915. I'm pretty sure that because it says outbuildings and all its furnishings, that included the carriages. So a lot of these carriages that we saw, and especially those wagonettes with the lettering on them, came from the Hillside Homeschool, and Frank Lloyd Wright acquired them in this $1 purchase. I think we can be quite certain about that. Frank Lloyd Wright started Taliesin in 1911. And a quote from his autobiography. He wrote it when he was quite a young man, by the way. The Taliesin's going to be a farm and a garden and a home and everything possible. Another quote talks about Frank Lloyd Wright driving up and around the hill through the porte cochere and into the inner courtyard that had handsome horse carriages and a collection of horses. And we know from the blueprints of Taliesin, all the various stages of the blueprints, that there were stables and carriage storage in the blueprints. And then this quote is worth a little read. I don't think it's very accurate, but I think it sold lots of papers because it certainly has a lot of character in the quote. And that was 1932, so it seems a little far-fetched. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright loved cars. We know he loved speed. When he lived in Chicago in Oak Park, he terrorized the neighbors driving his cars. As the roads in Wisconsin improved, the use of carriages declined. But, and I think because he was a romantic, and if you doubt that he's a romantic, take a look at that outfit. The cape, the beret, the tall boots, looking out over southwestern Wisconsin landscape, that's a romantic. He found a new use for the carriages. He changed them from a means of transportation to a means of recreation. Now the quote at the bottom is from Herb Fritz, one of the fellowship members, and I had lots of quotes from him talking about the carriages that were still at Taliesin. A brougham, a cab, a wagon wagon with seats along the sides, which is that wagonette that we saw going to meet the train. So instead of using them as transportation, they became recreation. During the Great Depression, commissions for designs diminished. School, like the homeschool, learning by doing, the fellowship school was formed by Frank Lloyd Wright and Olga Vanna to keep the wolf from the door. How did it work? Well, they had paying students, architectural students, that came to Taliesin. They lived there, they worked there, they learned from the master, they worked the dairy farm and the gardens, they supplied the food for the kitchen and then cooked it and served it. They cut and quarried their own building materials for construction. They maintained the dam that supplied power to generate electricity. And if you've ever seen any photographs of the fellowship, they worked, and I mean they worked hard. So they lived by one of his favorite axioms, add tired to tired. In other words, you don't just stop working, you just change jobs. So if you're really tired of dairy farming, you start gardening for a few hours to relax. But they also had a lot of other kinds of activities that were relaxing, and one of them was picnic drives. And they would go out, sometimes with cars, sometimes with horses, sometimes with carriages, sometimes all three together, and they'd go around the various places in southwestern Wisconsin, and they would picnic, and that was a relaxing activity after the hard work. So that's where the fellowship fell in with the Hillside Homeschool, with the same basic kind of work. Ready for a picnic drive? This is, I think, a posed photograph, but it's a carriage at Taliesin, as you can tell from the background, and it came out of a book about Frank Lloyd Wright. Okay, so Howard, does this look like a Victoria, the passenger seat of a Victoria?
It could be.
We know there was a Victoria there, so I'm wondering, but because Herb Fritz described the Victoria. And this is especially interesting because it's in color, and we don't have very many color photographs from this early time. It was done in 1948 by a woman named Lois Gottlieb, who sent me the slide. And she was one of the members of the fellowship that I interviewed about the carriages. And there's Frank Lloyd Wright and Olga Vanna going out on a picnic drive. And I've zeroed in on the carriage because that's that rubber-tired Phaeton that's in the still there at Taliesin. I had made an appointment for September 14th, 2001 to interview the fellowship members that were living there at Taliesin that fall. And there were several elderly members there, and I wanted to get a chance to talk to them before they went back to Scottsdale for the winter. I had it all set up, and as you remember what happened on September 11th, I thought, this can't possibly take place. I mean, if you remember that chaotic feeling that we all had, it was like, how can I focus on something like this when what's going on in the world? And then I thought, well, if I don't do this now, maybe I won't get it done, and maybe I'll miss some of them. And so I went. And I drove into Taliesin and up to their apartments. And it was like I was in another world. It was so calm and so peaceful. I interviewed several of the fellowship members. Not one of them mentioned anything about what had just happened in our lives. Instead, they focused on what I was asking about Frank Lloyd Wright and what they remembered about the Carriages. And they all had special interests there. Some of them were gardening, and some of them were painting, and some of them were doing photography, and some of them were writing books. They were very sharp. But it was almost like I was in a monastery because the whole world had been kept out. That's how I spent that little bit of time after September 11th, and I'm so glad that I did. One of the quotes that I got from Frances Nimton, who was still alive then, she died about 2 years ago, was about that photograph that was taken of the two vehicles in the wedding, that were going to the wedding. And she told me about how they had decorated and all of that sort of thing. And then she said, and if you'll look at the very bottom of that quote, "The roof seat omnibus followed with the parents of the bridal couple. The guests threw oats instead of rice." Now this is the picture of the bridal couple and Frank Lloyd Wright leading. And this is the picture of the omnibus that the parents of the bridal couple were going to ride in. You can see that roof seat up there. It's all decorated up and everything, but it's there in the luggage rack behind it. Keep this carriage in mind, because we're going to be looking at some more of it later. Another person that I interviewed in the fellowship was Indira Berenson, and she gave me a photocopy of this photo. It was taken at Taliesin. It's a Curtin Rockaway. She said it was taken about 1944, and she can date it because of the ages of the children again. Her father, Peter, who was in the fellowship, is in front. Cornelia, her mother, is in the back, and Cornelia Brierly I interviewed on September 14th, 2001. She was almost blind, but she was very sharp. And then Indira is sitting next to her father, and Anna is in the back sitting next to her mother. And this little boy right there in the middle, that's Brandock Peters, the one that was driving the governance cart. Now, they're not going anywhere. This is an imaginary journey. There's no horse on there, and there's no lines. They're not going to drive anywhere, but the kids were out for a little journey there anyway. Nothing in the books and articles I was reading told me about what had happened to many of the Carriages, but the personal interviews began to give me some insight. Sheboygan and carriage restorer was mentioned by several fellowship members. I began to pursue this avenue. I knew the Wisconsin Carriage Museum at Wade House from taking my 4th grade class when I was a teacher in Milwaukee. All of the 4th graders always got to visit Wade House because they studied Wisconsin history. And I had visited the archives here when I had attended a CDE here a number of years ago. So I knew it was time for another visit to the collection here. Wesley Young came from a carriage and wagon building family in Sheboygan. And he was a CPA, and that's important. You're going to see why it's important to my research, because CPAs keep really good records. And that's important when you're trying to do research. He started collecting and restoring carriages and wagons with a focus on those built by his family, the Young family. And here's the connection. Frank Lloyd Wright was asked to be the Grand Marshal of the Spring Green Centennial Parade in 1957. And for whatever reason, he decided he wanted one of Wesley Young's carriages to ride in the parade. And the fellowship members, several of them told me about going all the way to Sheboygan to pick up a carriage, bringing it back to Taliesin, practicing with it with the horses, driving it in the parade, and then taking it all the way back to Sheboygan again. It must have been something that they really thought about because it wasn't traditional, what they were used to doing, here, okay, we're not doing architecture, we're not doing gardening, we're not doing farm work, we're driving around picking up a carriage. And I started wondering after Daniel Lieberman and some of the other fellowship members told me about this, I started wondering, okay, so if Frank Lloyd Wright had carriages at Taliesin, why was he driving this particular carriage? Well, this was a decade after most of those pictures were taken, so perhaps the carriages were already too decrepit to take in a parade. Maybe they just didn't look good enough. Or, and this is my own supposition, but I think it might have some legitimate proof. The musical Oklahoma had debuted on Broadway in 1943. And in 1955, it had been made into a movie. And in 56, it won the Academy Award for Best Musical. This was 57 when the parade was taking, so just a year later. And what have we got in Oklahoma that everybody is singing? Yeah, the Surrey with the fringe on top. And look at those last couple lines of lyrics. When I drive them high-steppin' strutters, nosy pokes will peek through their shutters and their eyes will pop. Well, Frank Lloyd Wright had American saddlebred horses on this carriage, and they are high-steppin' strutters. And I can just imagine Frank Lloyd Wright thinking, I'll show them in the parade. Yeah, I'm going to have this impressive Surrey with the fringe on top, and there it is. A canopy-top Surrey in this July 1957 Spring Green Centennial Parade, driven by Ken Lockhart, one of the fellowship members, and Frank Lloyd Wright and Olga Vanna are passengers. And indeed, it must have made quite a scene because Look magazine covered it, and it was in the September issue of Look magazine in 1957. So there's the Wesley Young connection. A couple more quotes from members of the fellowship. Jim Pfefferkorn and John Rattenberry, both architects, one in Spring Green and one in Scottsdale, told me about going to Sheboygan, seeing a carriage restorer, seeing a vehicle similar to the omnibus when I showed them pictures of it, and that they thought after Frank Lloyd Wright died, some more carriages were sent to that restorer. I needed a trip to the archives here to see what I could find, and I took it in the spring of 2002. Oh, I'm sorry. Good you told me. There, okay. I found this catalog in the archives, and it was done in 1958. Wesley Young had a showing of 50 of his carriages in Sheboygan at the ballpark, and they're all numbered in the catalog, and the numbers in the catalog match the numbers on the 1961 insurance inventory that Wesley Young had. Remember, he's a CPA. And on the insurance inventory, it tells which ones were acquired from Frank Lloyd Wright. And number 76, Omnibus, is in that catalog, was shown at that exhibition, and it says restoration incomplete. It had been started, the restoration had been started in 1957, but not finished. Here's the insurance inventory. And I apologize for it looking like this, but I never thought I was going to put it in a PowerPoint when I was using it for a working research project. But I wanted to show you that down at the bottom on the left-hand side are numbers 76 through 80, and up on top on the right-hand side 81 through 84, and they're all listed as being acquired from Frank Lloyd Wright. So we've got 76 rubber-tired omnibus. Now these are the terms that Wesley Young used in his insurance inventory. 77 rubber-tired governess cart, 78 jaunting cart, 79 rubber-tired phaeton, 80 steel-tired 8-passenger carryall, 81 steel-tired hunting brake, 82 rubber-tired 4-passenger do-si-do, and 83 and 84 side spring cutters. And then 85 is that canopy top wagon, which was not acquired from Frank Lloyd Wright. In the 1963 inventory, so that the previous one was the 61 inventory. In the 63 inventory, 83 and 84, the numbers have been assigned to some other vehicles. So either those cutters were sold or they were returned to Taliesin. In the 65 inventory, only 76, the omnibus, remains. And then in the next inventories, that's still the only one. And of course, we know that the whole collection of Wesley Young's went to the State Historical Society in '68, and the only vehicle that was acquired from Frank Lloyd Wright was number 76, the omnibus. Well, why? And I brought this up with some of the fellowship members too. Why did the omnibus stay and the other vehicles went back to Taliesin and they didn't get restored? And what we could come up with probably was there was no money to pay for a restoration, and probably the omnibus didn't get paid for, and it was kept by Wesley Young for non-payment. Now, it was evidently at the time, fairly expensive restoration. I talked to one of the craftsmen that had worked on the restoration, and he said that they had used expensive materials. And in that case, probably it didn't get paid for, and that's why it's here. And here it is. Rubber-tired omnibus, number 76. He estimates that it was made in 1890. That's the amount that he had insured for in the inventory, and that it was restored. The governess card on the inventory, and where it was stored and possibly when it was built. This one he calls a jaunting cart, and I called it a gig. I don't think he means Irish jaunting car. That's a different kind of carriage altogether. It's got outside seating. I think he just meant it'd be fun to take it out for a jaunt. And since there wasn't a real definitive name for it, jaunting cart is just what he called it. And then this little Brewster, the rubber-tired phaeton, he doesn't mention that it's Brewster at all, but in his inventory he doesn't mention anything that's not a Young carriage. If it wasn't made by Young, doesn't need a manufacturer listed. Now he estimates that it was made in 1880. It was actually made in 1899, and I'll show you how we got proof of that a little later on. And then this number 80 steel-tired passenger carryall. This was when I got excited. When we pulled this vehicle out in 2002, a woman named Sue Schutz helped me, she's a volunteer at Taliesin, helped me pull it out. And when we got it outside so we could actually see what it looked like inside the carriage, that tag on the left, number 80, was in it. And it's got Wesley Young's business card on it. So, I mean, definite proof. This went to Sheboygan and it came back. So we know. We also know that it wasn't made in 1875. It was made in 1894 because that's when the Spring Green newspaper said it was delivered to Hillside Homeschool. And then number 81, steel-tired hunting brake. This took me on a real search. When we found this at Taliesin, that's what it was. That's what remains of that carriage, a seat back. But it's got the tag tied onto it, so we know it went to Wesley Young. We know it's this vehicle. But where did it go? Well, after a lot of tracking down, I think maybe I have an answer. Patty Kemper Kaiser and her husband Bill, who was an architect, were frequent visitors at Taliesin. They were friends of Ogavana. And Patty's cousin, Jackson Kemper, was a Morgan horse breeder and a carriage driver who lived in Barrington Hills, Illinois. His second wife, who I interviewed, June Butler Kemper, remembers that one of the Wright carriages came to Jackson. It was as a gift. And she said it was old and it had a fleur-de-lis decoration cut into it. Well, as I was researching this, I talked to John Greenall, the carriage collector, and he had bought a brake from Jackson Kemper in the 1980s, and it was old, steel-tired, and it had a fleur-de-lis cut into the seat riser panel. And later, he took it to Martin's auction and sold it. So I think that's where the carriage went. Where it sold from Martin's, we don't know. But it certainly seems possible that that's number 81. We've got the seat back, somebody else has got the carriage. Number 82, rubber-tired four-passenger Dosido. Dosido is back-to-back. And the side spring cutter. Now, there's no positive identification on that, but it does have side springs. You can see them on the right there. So I think that's either 83 or 84 is that cutter that went to Wesley Young and came back to Taliesin. And then, of course, that's 85, which never was acquired from Frank Lloyd Wright, but it was probably more famous because he wrote in it and it was in the newspaper and Look magazine. This one was made by Young. What happened to all the carriages that were at Hillside Home School in Taliesin? We know there was a Victoria, a Brougham, a Rockaway, several wagonettes, runabout. Where did they all go? Well, possibly, if you'll look here, this is a runabout type vehicle. Frank Lloyd Wright is driving. His daughter Iavana is with him, and Ogavana, his wife, is with him. And if you'll take a look at that dash right there, it's pretty much tipping off. Maybe they just all wore out. And a lot of them were not kept, and finally they couldn't be used anymore, and they disappeared the way most carriages do when they're not of any use. There is no record of how many were originally there, but we know there were quite a few. They were kept in the upper and lower courts until 1990, and that's when they went to Midway Barn. So the barn where we found them, the 5 vehicles that were there, had been there from 1990 to 2000. And Marcus Weston, who I interviewed several times, a member of the fellowship, said he remembered a bunch of them just being pushed into a gully and left, and he thought it was maybe because the barn that they had been stored in at Hillside had been taken down. There still are 7. They are now stored in a barn on an adjacent property to part of the property to Taliesin. Okay, what would they look like if they had had a different life? Well, on the left you can see, and I've given several names to this because these are all appropriate names: dog cart phaeton, hunting trap, or Dosido, spelled 2 different ways. That's the one on the left is what's remaining at Taliesin. The one on the right came out of the Seabrook collection, and it has been restored and used a lot. but stored completely differently. They're basically the same kind of vehicle. They're not duplicates, but you'll see the louvers on the side and over here, back-to-back seating, patent leather dash. And this little vehicle that I called a gig body, four-wheel gig, when I looked in Martin's catalog, there was a very similar vehicle to it. They called a sidebar sailor, and that has two different spellings. And if you'll notice, okay, we've got the basket weave pattern on both of them. We've got the handhold here and here. We've got 3 purchase, wheels all the same size. Very similar vehicle. And then this one, the Brewster. Remember I told you that the Brewster records have, if you have the serial number, you can get lots of information. Well, on the left is the vehicle from the Frank Lloyd Wright collection, and with its serial number. And on the Brewster records, it was called a skeleton gig. It was ordered by J.N. Bonaparte in 1899, and it sold for $437. The vehicle on the right was made a little later in 1910. It was called on the Brewster records a skeleton sidebar gig. It was ordered by Otis P. Clark in October 13th of 1910. It was in the Cosin collection in Pennsylvania, and then it went to the Martin Giles Antiques in the UK, and in 2011 it was for sale for $23,000. And again, that same vehicle, the one on the left is where it's being stored right now in the Frank Lloyd Wright collection. It's on an earthen floor with a steel building. And the one on the right is in the Karen Arkbauer collection here in Wisconsin. That one was made in 1902, and on the record it was called a sidebar skeleton golf gig. It was ordered by William H. Armstrong, and it sold for $525 in 1902. And that side spring Portland cutter, the one with the manufacturer's tag so we know who made it, on the left is the one that's in 3 pieces at Taliesin, and on the right is a vehicle from the Colonial Carriage Works collection in original condition. Now, this one hasn't been restored. That's what careful storage means when you're storing an antique. If you'll look at that, it's the original paint and the original upholstery, and it still looks pretty good. I think you could take it out for a drive. It's a side spring cutter. It was made by the same manufacturer, but storage makes a lot of difference. And then our roof seat omnibus. And this is just one of my very favorite parts of the research, because Lois Gottlieb told me that she had a slide of a carriage, and she was working in color in 1948, a carriage at Taliesin that she wanted me to see. And so she sent me the slide, and yes, you can see the carriage over there, but it's not easily identifiable. But when I took it to a photographer and had it blown up on the right, there's the carriage. We've got Taliesin there as proof, and it's the roof seat brake. It's under dust covers, thank heavens maybe, huh? But there's that high seat, and look at the color. Black body and red wheels. Okay. Same vehicle, on the left when it was at Taliesin, on the right after Wesley Young got it and restored it. Now this is a roof seat omnibus. It was often used by hotels and excuse me, sometimes private residences. They became a mainstay of public transportation. The vehicle seats 6 to 8 on the inside and 5 or 6 on the exterior, with cargo room behind the roof seat. The same omnibus before and after restoration. And if you've looked in the museum, it's in there, it's clearly visible. It's kind of yellowish and tan, if you've noticed, and it's high. I mean, when you looked, I was in there this afternoon and a man was looking at it and he said, oh my gosh, how did you ever get up on that thing? Okay, why did Wesley Young take that lovely vehicle and turn it into a very unusual colored vehicle? I've got a couple of thoughts on that. I don't know if it's true or not, but first of all, maybe he was attempting to make it look like the French taxi cabs, because in France they used a lot of omnibuses as taxi cabs and they were painted yellow. So maybe that's what it was. Or remember, it was completed in 1967. If you'll think back to 1967 and the way people used color, harvest gold appliances, avocado appliances, shag carpeting in both of those colors. The late 60s was not a good time for artistic use of color, and maybe that had something to do with it. I don't know. That's just what I see when I look at it. Mr. Wright's last ride was by horse-drawn vehicle in April 1959. After his death in Arizona, his body was returned to Wisconsin. The funeral procession moved sedately from Taliesin to Unity Chapel in the valley. At the head were 2 black horses drawing a farm wagon on which rested the remains of Mr. Wright, draped with flowers and greens. Behind this vehicle walked the mourners. And then, just as a little aside, notice on the left his gravestone, his birth date's wrong. And it's still there. It took a lot of people to help me with this research project, and I have a few of them listed. There is no happy ending to my tale. The carriages can't be sold or given away, and there is no money to restore them or a place to exhibit them if they were restored. But I hope you've enjoyed going along on the 2-year journey with me in this research project. That was the microphone for Oshkosh. Your microphone just dropped off. If you have questions that I can answer, which maybe and maybe not, but if there's anything about the research that you're wondering about.
You had a picture of the Young factory.
Uh-huh.
It says carriages on the left and wallpaper on the right.
Yes. I don't know. They had, I can't read German, but I think they had a lot of things.
There were members of the family that were in other businesses.
and when I looked at it, it looked like a lot of different things that they were manufacturing or selling. Mm-hmm.
I hope this isn't a silly question, but you mentioned that one of the carriages is suitable for a horse 16 hands too.
16.2.
Would you have a horse that size and then order the carriage, or would you have a carriage that size and then buy a horse?
Well, that's kind of a good question. Today, what we usually do is we have horses and we either find carriages for them or we have carriages made for them. But back then, people had carriages and they just got horses that fit them. And sometimes they got horses that didn't fit them very well. But yeah, it's kind of different now. Mm-hmm.
This is out of your wheelhouse, but the first pictures had a vehicle that looked like a Rolls Royce grill under a tarp. And I'm so curious if that vehicle in the dirt floor was something luxury that you noticed even.
I don't know what it was because we didn't take the cover off. I know up above at Taliesin there was a Mercedes, an old Mercedes up there, but that was still being used. It was one of the fellowship's cars. Yes?
Is the yellow omnibus here? In this
Yes.
museum?
Yes, it's here in the museum.
Yeah. Right here.
And so you can get a good look at it and see what you think about why it changed from a black with red wheels. Yes?
So going back to the horse and carriage question, you're saying they put the cart before the horse?
Kind of. People often had whole stables or carriage houses full of carriages. And so if you had a particular kind of carriage and you wanted to use it, you just bought a horse for that. I mean, 'cause it was not hard to get a horse. So. And we still, those of us who really love carriages, if you really love a specific carriage, you find a horse for it. Yes?
How many horses were there at Taliesin?
I don't know. There were a lot of them because they had draft horses that they used for farming at one time. And then they had several different driving horses that I saw, because I have more pictures than this, but some of them were photocopies that were too poor to use. But they were different colors, so I could tell they were different horses. And then there's a quote in one of the letters that Olga Vanna wrote to, and I can't remember who she wrote it to, and she said that Frank Lloyd Wright had bought her a new horse named, I think it was named Rusty. And you know, I mean, so enough horses were mentioned, so they must have had quite a few. And then those two in that, on the Surrey were Gay Boy and Bopaloo. So, you know, I mean, there were horses around there. And Frank Lloyd Wright had one that he rode that was named Johnny Walker. He was a Tennessee Walker. So. Mm-hmm.
How many carriages do you have in your estate?
Oh, mine, my private one? Not many. About a dozen. Well, I mean, people that are collectors lots of times have 20, 30, 40, 100, you know, I mean, it kind of depends. I only have carriages I use, so I don't collect just to have them. Howard, how many carriages have you got in your collection?
I don't know, that way you don't have to lie to my wife. About 30 probably.
But he doesn't use them all.
That's true. Most of them my wife.
And I encourage any of you who thought any of this was even slightly interesting to come over this weekend and see the carriages actually used. You'll see some beautiful carriages being used here.
Whereabouts is that going to be on the property here?
Right over there.
Right up?
Yes, if you pick up one of those maps, you'll see a space marked arena. You arrive here and we'll have horse-drawn transportation that will take you over to the arena, so you'll be able to see.
Mm-hmm.
Right up to the,
I have a carriage house.
We are in Wisconsin.
I'm from St. Croix Falls, which is the western side of the state. I mean, I'm on the Minnesota border. I can see Minnesota from my house. So I probably sound like Minnesota.
you got a long drive home today?
No, I'm staying for the show. Yes?
I'm assuming that this is a climate-controlled building and everything.
It is to a certain extent. The only thing you really have to worry about in Wisconsin is humidity in the summer. The cold in the winter doesn't seem to bother the carriages as long as it's not heated. If you heat a building, then you've got to do something about humidity in the winter too, because it's like furniture, dries out. But carriages, optimal storage, somewhere between like 45 and 60% humidity, and they're fine. Anything more than that, and leather starts to mildew. If you get them too dry, if you get below 45%, you can start getting cracks in the hubs and things like that. But it's kind of like furniture.
So what was left of the leather at Taliesin on these carriages, how many, kind of moldy?
Yeah, well, the ones that were outside, no, because
There was enough air.
yeah, there was enough air, but it was all cracked, and I mean, you can't store something like that for that long a time without it really falling apart. You know, it's just the leather was pretty much gone, and I mean, like a lot of those that you saw pictures of, the dash was leather and it was gone. It was just gone.
So those carriages are still in the
Mm-hmm. Not in Midway Barn, they're in another barn.
Oh, okay.
They're in a steel barn.
And most of them are so far gone, they couldn't be restored now?
Well, yeah, you can restore almost anything if you've got the iron, but it would take a lot of quality work to bring them back. I mean, you can have wheels made, you can have all of those things made, but it's very expensive. It's just, it's not a cheap project in any means for restoring a carriage. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.